Yeah.
This is so special.
Yeah, people want to see this after the fact.
This is Dougie.
Yep. Yeah, I go by BW because my first name's Brian, and in the 80s there were a lot of Brians, so I just like to circumvent that thing right before. So just don't call me Brian, call me Dougie. Cool. So I'm actually going to talk about React and Rails, and I talked to this guy before we started, and it's funny how I don't want to even say our thoughts are actually that opposite, because I'll get into that later. But yeah, I'm just going to talk about React and Rails. And the title is "In a Tree," and I thought I was going to add more things about trees in here, but I didn't really get to that. So KISS, and you get the picture. Okay, cool. So I missed that. So Rails is actually great at being Rails. Would we all agree? I think the last talk pretty much proved, when you use Rails the right way, it works really well for you. And Oprah actually proves that for me. Has anybody heard the KISS principle? I'm pretty sure everybody has. So, anybody know what it stands for?
Keep it simple.
Exactly. Keep it super simple. Anyway, actually, I wanted to preempt this. How many people actually use Rails? Cool. I wouldn't expect that. How many people actually use React? Or have used it? Read the documentation? Use Facebook? Okay, cool. Awesome. So what's this talk about? This talk's actually about Rails and React. This talk actually will not teach you React. I'm sorry. I'm not going to go line by line with code. I really don't I like talks that have lots of code in it, but I didn't really think this talk would be really good if I just spent the entire time showing code. I do have code, but I'm not going to get there. I do recommend if you want to learn React, either go to the Facebook documentation and just check that out, or Egghead has video series. So if you guys came to the Railscast back when that was good, I think Egghead does a really good job. And so React actually, a blog post that I wrote on Friday about deploying React in 30 seconds. I just wanted to mention that because I think React is actually getting a little easier. It's got its problems and it's got its concerns with the whole JavaScript ecosystem. But yeah, I just wanted to give a mention since I wrote that blog post, and I think you should read it. Coincidentally, actually today, the company I work for released a blog post about switching from Angular to React. So we actually had the same sort of position, but we went on the hype train. So there's that. Cool. So Rails is good at getting things done. It's really great at getting things done. I think again, the last talk is really proof of when you take away all those weird abstractions and that weird stuff to getting Angular to work in the asset pipeline and using Webpack and Rails, which is interesting in itself. I came from a company that did that. It wasn't pleasant at all. And so, sorry, I didn't even finish my thought. But anyway, monoliths are also great. So Rails, having that one ecosystem and having everything work, as far as teaching, it helps, especially with the Rails community. A lot of new developers are coming and learning Rails. To bring those people on, it makes it super easy when you don't have to teach them Angular or Webpack or all this other weird stuff. But Rails is not great sometimes. Anybody have seen this GIF before? This is one of my favorite GIFs. I think I actually use it in every single talk I've done so far. Actually, that's true. I didn't do it the 4JS talk I did. But this is an Italian Spider-Man, and it's basically they made a Spider-Man movie that had nothing to do with Spider-Man, and it's all in Italian, and this GIF is amazing. So, yeah, just soak that in. Cool, and there's a good talk. I think if you really are interested in what the first talk is all about, Justin Searles, it's weird because I started Rails in 2013. I've only been programming since 2013, and my first Ruby conference, this guy spoke at. So I keep seeing him at every conference I go to. So I like what he writes and what he talks about. He gave a talk about making Ruby great again, which it actually really falls in line with what the last talk was all about. I highly recommend checking it out. It's at the most recent Rails Conf in Kansas City. So I'm gonna get right into the I almost said a bad word. Anyway, not a bad word, an inappropriate word. Anyway, I won't tell you what I'm about to say. Anyway, I'm about to get into this presentation. Rails is a bit weird. And here are the weird things about Rails. So this asset pipeline, it works when you don't mess with it. It works perfectly. But then things like JavaScript, CoffeeScript, it's really confusing. Rails for a long time, it was the reason why you would do CoffeeScript, because Rails brought it. Like you had to actually use a flag to actually turn it off. I think now for default, when you start a new project, it starts in JavaScript. I'm not sure. I haven't started a new Rails project in a while, actually a long time. And then Turbolinks, question mark, I don't know. This guy said it was great. Every project I've started, we've always turned it off, so I have no idea. Question mark. And then action cable. Like, what is that? I don't know. Oh, the slide's too early. So basically, this is like my monolith. This is like what Rails is. This is like when you put peanut butter and jelly in the same jar. Like, it just works and it's perfect, like if you're doing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but if you wanted to do something like different, like biscuits or scones, peanut butter doesn't really make that much sense. Again, action cable, I had a little story for this. I actually, from a hacking project at a company I worked at, I built a chat app. Just a proof of concept for like help desk, whatever. Not really important. So I did a chat app, and I spent like probably half the hack day trying to figure out how to get WebSockets to work in Rails. And this is like months before even action cable was like a thing that was going to come out. Like it had a different code name. And I was like, oh man, how do I do WebSockets in Rails? And I found a blog post of a guy who was like, oh, this is how you do it. It was basically kind of like action cable. And then at the very end of the blog post, the very last paragraph, it's like, oh, this is good, but by the way, you should probably just use Node. So I was like, okay, whatever. So unfortunately, since action cable like is taking over the WebSocket in Rails, like SEO basically, I couldn't find that right blog post, but this blog post here says the same thing. Like basically, oh, by the way, just use Node type of deal. Action cable's not really there yet. I don't really recommend it in production. I don't think they even recommend it in production. So I have this question: why is Why is Rails so weird and confusing when it comes to JavaScript and the front end? I don't know. Does anybody have an answer?
History.
History?
No.
Yeah. We can talk about it later. Anyway, I'm not going to answer that question. The question's all about talks all about Rails and React, but I want to talk about Ember real quick. I know you guys are probably a little confused because this guy talked about Angular. I'm talking about React, and now I'm mentioning Ember. But Ember was actually my first JavaScript framework. It actually was a really good transition for me because I got in at a time when they were actually improving documentation, so I actually learned it when the learning curve was getting smaller. But one thing that Ember I really liked about was this concept. Like, it's a buzzword, it's a phrase that they talk about all the time. I think it's getting more popular with more frameworks. Separation of concerns. Does anybody know what that means when I say separation of concerns? It just means this. So it's just literally just separating the jelly out of the peanut butter. So again, separation concerns. So in the concept of this talk, React and Rails, I've got these two boxes. So I've got my jelly and my peanut butter, my API and my client. My approach, and this is the answer. So if you guys are writing this down, you want to take pictures, tweet it, whatever. My approach is use Rails for what it's really good at. Like, I can build stuff really quickly in Rails. Like, if I need to use a gem, I usually don't use as many gems anymore nowadays, but if I need to like use active record, look at my data, if I want to like prototype like user models, I can input devise or whatever everybody's using, whatever the new hotness is right now, and I can have that working really quickly. And with my client, not so much in Rails. I'm not really sure what's going on. When I did Rails, I actually was not very good at front end at all. Because I spent most of my time just making sure the back end, the models worked, and I let other people do the front end. So I never really got around to learning the front end when I did Rails up until maybe actually 18 months ago is when I really got into front end development. And then so when I mentioned API, you guys know what I mean by API? I know we're all different levels here, but so API is like basically just your data layer. It's living in its own repo. That's my Rails, and my front end is my client side. So all my UI, my JavaScript, my CSS, it all works perfectly in there. And I found that when I worked at a team, my first actual dev job that I worked at, we had a big problem where we could not get people to come on board as front-end developers because they knew JavaScript well, they knew CSS well, they knew HTML well, but they didn't know Rails well. They didn't know how Rails worked. And so that whole learning curve that this guy was talking about, it really, really like hurt us for recruiting. Like, we couldn't get we could get people like offers on the table, and then when they saw our code, they're like, you know what, never mind. I'm going to move on. So me personally, it really gave me an opportunity to really focus on what I knew really well in Rails, and then I could really try other things. And then as far as like getting the API nodes, so these are like literally two different repos. We're not building Webpack and then passing it on through like JSON or anything like inside the same Rails app. We're actually using two separate apps that are talking to each other. So we have the client and we have the API itself. And we just talk to each other through data and then also some cores and some other things. Super simple to get set up once you know what you're doing. Did anybody ever use the React on Rails gem? You have? Good. Because I do not endorse the React on Rails gem. at all. I don't really like the approach. It's kind of like monkey patching, like your front end into your asset pipeline. See what I did there? I was actually in LA and I saw a monkey, and I caught that one. Pretty proud of myself. So yeah, going back to the separation of concerns, like I don't want to have like this weird asset pipeline. I don't want to like get a senior front end developer to come and help me with my code and then realize they don't know what's going on because of this weird learning curve. Like I just want to learn CSS when I want to learn CSS, and I want to learn, well, I don't need to learn Rails, but I just want to do the Rails and then move on. Like that's it. And so development time for me is like really, really good as far as the Rails goes. So like with Rails, I listed all the things that like I was kind of questionable with. Things that Rails is really good at: testing, active record. I know it's got some gripe with some people outside of the Ruby community, but active record works really well as far as getting into your relational data, your Postgres. Like, does anybody write SQL queries out there? Is that a thing you guys like doing? Because I don't. And then the whole object-oriented programming, it works. And even if you do like, so Sandy Metz's approach to composability and stuff like that, that works well too. The last Rails meetup I went to, Jared actually talked about DCI. Like I use DCI, it works perfectly. And I can like abstract my data and like make it work, it runs fast, it's tested, don't have to worry about it. So literally all I do is Rails new, -- API, every new project I do, and it works. I've got my data, it's good to go. So here comes to React. So basically React is basically just JavaScript. It's actually pretty surprising how just JavaScript it is. Once you get past the ES6 stuff, I personally prefer ES6. I didn't really get into JavaScript until ES6 was like a really like approaching very fastly as a thing. I got into it like maybe a year before it actually was like in modern browsers permanently. And yeah, so take my word for it. I don't have code to show you this, but React is really just JavaScript. So you're probably wondering, this guy hasn't talked about any code, he hasn't shown any code. I'm actually going to show code in this next slide. Are you ready for it? You guys have your phones out, you going to take a picture of it? It's my code. Pretty good. It's actually, but anybody write JavaScript? This is not really JavaScript. This is JavaScript. See what I did there? Yeah, that's code. That's my code slide. So basically, I put the slide up because I think there's some people are like trying to compare React to jQuery. React is not jQuery. React is a small library that looks like jQuery. It's actually smaller than jQuery, and it works really well. And you can use it just like jQuery, but it's not jQuery. So I just wanted to point that out. If you have questions about that, I can go in more detail, but I just want to move along because I have some code I do want to show at the end. So hustling, I spelled it wrong, but actually I didn't. I literally spelled it wrong because I spelled it like this. Anyway, so I had an idea that I came up with. I moved here about 18 months ago, whenever baseball season just started. Very first game, when you get to like the actual not preseason, I'm gonna teach you guys baseball for now. Okay, I'm actually from Tampa, so like we have a baseball team, but nobody goes to the games. So baseball wasn't a thing that I really cared about until I got here. So first series of the season is the Bay Series, right? You got SF, you got Oakland. Everybody in the Bay Area goes to those games. This was the idea that I actually came up with because the very first Friday, after the first week I actually worked, I had just got an apartment, and I went to Target off of Mission downtown, got myself an air mattress, got myself like comforter, a blanket, and then I got on the BART. And I had worked late that night and went to Target, so when I got on the BART, the Bay Series game had just came out. I was like, oh, what is this? Like people actually go to games and stuff like that, and then they like get drunk and ride BART home and yell at each other the whole time about teams that nobody cares about really. Anyway, it was really annoying. So I built this app. I built a Rails API. It basically scraped ESPN.com. Don't tell them that I do that. But that scrapes ESPN.com and tells me when there's a home game. So that way I can judge based on, I use Moment to actually tell me what time, like distance, when the game started and when the game ended. So I can judge like, I should probably get on BART or I should probably not even try to go home. I'll just sleep in Dolores Park or something, I don't know. Anyway, so I built this app, I prototyped it, I made a Rails API, and the whole reason I did this too as well is because I really wanted to learn Ember at the time. So I built this API, and this is actually the React version of it because I rebuilt it. It's just like my toy app that I learn new things with at this point. So this is what it looks like. So San Francisco versus Oakland, it happens. It's it's funny because this is my JSON date. So you can see like in 7 hours it's going to start and stuff like that. As I took a screenshot at that time. If you go to, actually, I won't even show you your URL because the data's broken. This is the game it shows today. If you look at the date, so something messed up in my code. I haven't touched this in a while. Usually in the middle of the season, nobody goes to games anyway. So like I don't have to worry about this. I never even look at it. It's usually the beginning of the season. But yeah, this is my JSON. This is what my Rails code is like rendering, and I can consume this in the React app, and it's really great. If you guys are familiar with how to do that in Rails, if you haven't done it, that's pretty much all you need to do. You get your events and you render it to JSON. Voila. You also want to like open up cores too, but that's a whole other thing. It's super easy. There's a Rat Cores gem that you can include. I wrote a blog post on it that I didn't actually link in the talk there. I just realized I was going to, but I didn't. But it's super easy to do, especially if you're using Rails. It's literally a gem. You include it. And so I said this is the Rails code here. This is actually JavaScript code in my React app to actually consume my API. So I'm just like literally, I'm not going to go line by line. If you don't know JavaScript, get the book. You don't know JavaScript, I guess. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing. I'm actually taking the data and then I'm returning the actual blob, JSON blob, into a JavaScript object. Surprise, surprise, JSON and JavaScript work very well together. So there's not much you have to do with it after that. Actually, JSON works well in Rails as well too. So just FYI. So that's the gist of it. Like I build my API and I build my client separately. And the reason I do this too is also because I don't know if I'm gonna always want to use Rails. Like I'm at the point where I'm pretty confident in Rails. I can do stuff pretty quickly in Rails. I might want to try Elixir. I guess it's hot now. I don't know. I'll probably never try that. Actually, I do want to go outside of Rails. So I'll probably build an API on Go and then feed that to my React app and just see it. Like I said, this is like my toy app. So like this is where I try things. And like you said, you do Clojure. Like I do Go at home. I do a little bit of iOS and stuff like that. And so just as a recap, Rails API into my React UI. But wait, there's more. I could take that same API and put it in an Ember app. I could put it in an Angular 2 app. Like if we decide this is not working anymore, like we can back up and start building templates on top of our Rails API. And we can just have it right in line, and it works. So it's a really, really nice for prototyping. The companies I've worked at in the past, they haven't had like a super extremely, actually, I'd say the company I work for now actually has a large user base, but we actually do this already. But we recently went from Angular to React, and because we had an API already built on top of our React app, or our Rails API, it made the transition pretty easily. Since day one that I started, about 8 weeks ago, I think, maybe a little bit 9 weeks, I basically been writing React code that just translated Angular code to React code the entire time. And as of a week and a half ago, we unveiled our React app, and it was super easy. It was nice. And so at my company, actually, so I work at Netlify. It's a company that hosts modern websites, and we do websites that are based on like the Jamstack. Jamstack is probably should have asked if everybody knew what Jamstack was, but JavaScript APIs and markup. So basically, hosting stuff on Netlify is pretty agnostic. Like you don't have to know like if your code's going to work with Netlify. We're pretty agnostic. As long as you have like your markup and your API and everything else worked out on your own, you can host your site with us. And if you have basically if you have it in a similar setup like this, it makes it even easier too. So separate your repos, it works well. Quick note, the code I showed you before wasn't actually a React app, it was actually a React Native app. Yeah, same difference, it's almost the same code. So I just didn't have an actual React example to show for that app, but I will have it because I'll be live coding it real soon. So basically the moral of the story is keep it super simple. I almost said the other one. Keep it super simple. Like if you're gonna try this, like make sure your Rails code is good. Actually, I didn't even mention it too. Like, make sure your Rails code is tested. Make sure your API is tested. Make sure everything about like Rails that's good is good about your Rails code and your API, and you won't have problems in the future switching from React to Angular, Angular to React, or Vue.js, or whatever is a new thing that's going to happen next year. This is the company I work for. That's our logo. This is our site. Check it out. If you think of us as GitHub pages, but much better, that's basically what we do. And those are all my sites that I have currently hosted at my company. It's pretty legit. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to some live code? I know I moved pretty quickly. No? All right, you might have some questions when I do this. All right, I actually need to mirror screens. And I just realized I'm holding a microphone. It's okay, because you know what? Cool. So just that doesn't look right. Cool. Yeah, so this is the gist of it. This literally is like a Jamstack application right here, our sign-up flow. So basically we can like sign up. Somebody on Netflix? All right, there we go. So yeah, I've got like, wow, the resolution is like really, really bad. Yeah, so basically I have a list of my repos. I can pull them in. I can build my website based on this. And the API portion of this actually is GitHub. That's pretty much all it is. If you guys know, GitHub's built on Rails, and they feed their API with JSON. See? They do it too. So yeah, and I can just like get all my repos, and I can build them. And if I wanted to build a testing repo, so I can set my, so this is a middleman site. I just have to do a build command, and it builds down to like the way you would build a front-end project. And then like literally it just starts building, and you can see it live eventually. I won't wait for that. Actually, I'll show you. We also have GitLab and Bitbucket. Ooh, Rails error, or Redux error actually. That's what that was. Sorry, I thought I was going to live code, so I was going to do this while I was building my React app up. Did I just put that in Google? Am I like 60 years old? All right. Yeah, and you have organizations too. I'm part of the Easy organization. That's my Kanye Easter egg in there. It was going to be much better, but since I'm not coding, whatevs. All right, so that's my API. This is live on Heroku. That's kind of how I host most of my Rails stuff. I mean, who doesn't really? So yeah, that's my data. That's my wrong data. And this is, oh, whoop, wow, that's not it. There it is. So Facebook basically just talked about a boilerplate that came out earlier this week. I was able to get this Facebook app like up 15 minutes before I got into a Lyft to come over here. And here's my React data. And let's look at what the code looks like. Let me know if you can see this. So yeah, so this is the code. Literally, this is just JavaScript. Nothing different here. I showed you this in a slide. This is my React app. That's why it's called app. And then I'm pulling in the data through props. I didn't actually slow down and tell you about states and props, but just note that states are kind of like, state is an instance variable, and props are like global variables that are accessible, but only accessible when you within the scope of the component. So you have to pass in the props to actually get access to the prop, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is pretty much all I'm doing. I am pulling the first event because I already know I have one. Not really great code there, but it is what it is. I'm logging into the console because I want to prove I can do it, and I'm just routing the data, putting in the name, using JSX. You can look it up and see what JSX is really all about. I like it a lot. I'm actually doing a talk at React.js and SF more about this, of making designers happy. This flow actually is really, really good for designers who know how to code, and I'll talk more about that. If you don't make it to that, I'll actually tweet it out after the fact. And there's one thing I did want to show that I will live code, and I will not talk. Actually, I will talk. So all this code here, like, it's not really reusable. If you're familiar with how partials work and Rails, actually, I already created a partial earlier. Just gotta remember what it was. Actually, so you know what? I already showed you that. Yeah, this small screen is really killing me. So with components, I can pass in the prop. What I'm doing here is passing in the prop into my events component. I think for this is actually called events. Name any events, and then I'm actually cool. Yeah, so I'm able to do like partials. So you can see like what a component actually really looks like there. And if I didn't break anything, it still works. Looks like my server's not running. Server-side rendering. All right, just kidding. I never ran the server. That's what happened. But I'm still looking at JavaScript. So that's server-side rendering. Any questions? I could probably answer the same questions you asked him too if you want to ask him again. Go ahead.
Browserify or Webpack?
Webpack is what I use. Facebook is already like jump on the Webpack train with their boiler. So I think that's the way the community's going. Browserify works. You just have less tutorials out there for you. React's pretty new as far as community-wise, so it's hard to like really go off the rails when you learn React. So it's much easier to use something everybody else is using. React is also, Facebook's all about like not having conventions, which is part of the problem of React, because you basically have to relearn it depending on which company you're working at, and like when did you start your Rails app or your React app? Did I see a hand back there?
So it sounds like during today all talks that it's about maturity as a company and it's about integration point between Rails and clients.
Yeah.
Or API and clients. So there are a bunch of ways to document APIs in Rails and API resources in Rails. Particularly, I use Swagger, I use iTheory.
Yep. So
any thoughts on that? Any kind of learnings or suggestions?
So at Netlify, we use Swagger for our API and documentation. So I don't know if that answers your question. I have not yet done much of the backend code. I've done very little Rails code since I've actually been here at this company. So yeah, I just know that we use Swagger and we just got it up and running last week as far as documentation wise. This guy.
From an architecture perspective, like how do you manage like your directories, within the two apps? I mean, I feel like it's pretty common sense of like managing an API and like a client side to consume, but do you manage like different repos, or do you entirely split them, or do you host your client side code within the Rails app itself, and consequently build it out? Like how do you manage, what do you consider the best practices for architecture between the two?
I think so. I have a personal opinion. Plus, I should have probably preempted everything I said about this is not gospel at all. Like, this is what I do. But with that being said, 2 repos is ideal. Hosting your API separate from your front end is also ideal. I wouldn't do like this weird like Makey patching and stuff like that to try to get stuff like your node to build after your Rails is already up. It gets really interesting, and also it can get brittle, especially when people who set it up leave. So yeah, it's happened. It happened at a company I worked at.
Can I do a follow-up on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So I'm curious if you do keep your repos separate, how you coordinate changes in the API layer and the front-end layer. And actually, really quick, I haven't had the experience of trying to set up front-end frameworks inside of Rails, and I do really like your approach of like just doing those things separately. It's really smart.
Yeah, it's separating them. Sorry, what was your first question?
So I'm curious about, there's 2 things, right? So there's really not using sprockets and the asset pipeline.
Yeah.
And then there's actually keeping things in separate repos.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like I know Facebook just has like, as far as I can tell, like one giant repo.
Yeah.
And so, which sounds pretty weird on the outside, but I've also had the experience of having to coordinate deploys from different repos as an API changes. So I'm just curious if you have advice on how to do that well.
I haven't been at this company so long to know exactly the way it goes, but as far as like API changes, we don't do them unless we have to do them, and then you do the coordination around that. So me is like, since I'm doing main on the front end, and I did that at my last job, actually, so in the description I said I've been doing Rails for 6 months. I've actually been doing React Native for a year now, so I don't know if that counts, or React for 6 months, but I've been doing actual React for 6 months, and at my last project that I did all of it for, I did the Rails API, I did the front end, I really tried to fight when I was doing front end things. If I didn't have the API endpoints, I wasn't gonna like get stashed and jump back and like change the Rails code, push it, deploy it, and then wait for it to update and then like move on to the front end. I tried to keep the separation concerns, even though I was one developer, keep the separation concerns pretty strict. Because when you start like going on different branches and fixing stuff in the back end while you're doing the front end, it gets a little confusing. If your back end is not there, then if you have a separation of concerns as far as teams, like open up an issue and get the back end people to do it, or like stop what you're doing, get the back end to work, and like make it legit. Did you have a follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, practically speaking, when you end up letting your API out into the wild such that people are using it that you can't coordinate with, which is one of the good things about doing it this way, you use versioning, right? Version 1 of your API is a contract, and you never vary from that contract. When it's time to do version 2, you can either get version 1 or version 2. Yeah. In either case, you make an agreement essentially.
Yeah, it's actually versioning is definitely. I didn't do versioning in my last app because we had never even deployed the app that I worked on. We never got on version 1. Like it's pretty sad. I'm really sad about that app. But versioning is really ideal. Like if you can like version, have releases, have release notes, especially if people are like actually consuming your API outside of just your team. Like do it the right way. Do it the way you do like Simver and everything like that. Like treat your API as, even if it's not even open source, like treat it as an open source project and follow like good guidelines on that, and then you should be good. And then way in the back.
So with this client-side approach, if you have a standalone React app, there's no way really to mix it with Rails templates anymore, right?
No. Yeah. The separation concerns right down the middle. No Rails templates. You can backtrack and start adding templates on top of it. So the app I worked on, it was a list of all boot camps in the entire world. And we actually did have one Rails template on our API, which was like just like small data, like images, like we had logos and everything like that. And we served it on like a super janky like Rails template that just so our designer can like just like understand what was going on there. So you could totally have a template on top of your API. You could have documentation in your Rails API that's serving within the same ecosystem. So that's totally possible as well.
I think we have a very similar setup where we have the Rails API and then on the front end we have React and Redux. But there are two things that were very problematic to me and kind of annoying to me. I'm just wondering whether you experience the same problems.
Probably.
So the first problem is you have to write a lot of code to map the back end and front end compared to where you just have one thing that's doing everything. And the second thing is for the Redux store, I find it kind of difficult when the app grows large to keep the backend data and the front-end data in sync all the time. Yeah. And then before putting it into Redux store, you have to kind of normalize the nested data structures, and then you have to do a lot of work to get it exactly right. And I think it felt really good as a developer to learn the new things and get everything right. And everyone's using Babel, Webpack, and I mean it feels good. But then I realized it kind of slowed our development team down, especially because we don't have a very big front-end team and very big back-end team working to coordinate with each other. So I'm just wondering whether you experience the same thing, whether like doing it this way kind of feels more clean, but at the end you have a slower development speed.
Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, I've experienced that for my first React app. So just understand for everybody that doesn't do React, Redux is not like something you have to do. The first app that I actually used, I had no Redux. Actually, up until the last week that I worked at that company, I had Redux like the last week. And I was like, there you go, guys, good luck. But anyway, Redux is like a really big, like, I think the learning curve for React is Redux, really. It's really challenging to like wrap your brain around a different way of organizing your data. So yes, the learning curve is definitely there with Redux. Redux is like very, very new. The concept of Flux is very new. So you understand that going into a React project, how you want to manage your data. There's other options besides Redux, but I don't know if they're better or worse because I've only used Redux in a React app, and I've only used Redux really in one out of the 2 React apps I've used. Actually, in my React Native apps, I use no Redux. I use all like built in, just passing in props and state. And sorry, real quick. So I did the React.js training, which is like the React Router guys, Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson. Yeah, that's his real name. And they basically, Mike actually gave the training, and he actually is pro. Don't use Redux until you have, until you really have to, because states and props actually will do most of the work for you, depending on your app. Now, this is something like architectural-wise you have to think about, and then React 2. I probably should preface this too. Is like this is like cutting edge on a air quotes cutting edge technology. Like you're on the forward like thinking train. Like you're buying into the React ecosystem and buying into the problems that come with it. There are problems with React. So you have to understand that going in. So my blog post I put about today about Angular to React is, first thing I said, like, or third thing I said actually, is like invest in learning. Like really invest the time to learn. And also the first thing I said is be prepared to slow down development time. Like it's gonna happen. Like learn anything new, you're gonna have to do it. There's no expert on the team that already knows it. Then like take time to learn it and take time to not ship new features, which is going to happen. We had to postpone a couple features until a couple weeks ago because we wanted to make sure we had the React stuff pretty stable and good to go. Yeah.
So one of the things I was going to ask is when you're, like in terms of your API design and, now that we're talking like within React and, specifically like components, are you creating endpoints for the entire view itself, or are you managing an API like for each individual component? Because if you're not going to be using Redux, like you don't have like a single point of truth, right? Like where you're hitting a single function to obtain the whole state for that entire view, and then consequently pass it on to your children components. So like, are you using just a single endpoint for like that entire view, or are you managing multiple endpoints for each component?
So the answer really is no, because the API came along before. Like the API has been around for like a year and a half, I think, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So like we're building the React app based on the API that we already have. There's this concept of containers. Actually, I have a blog post I'll be coming out with it very soon, but about containers and components. Mm-hmm. And containers themselves are what actually takes in the data.
Yeah,
and,
smart, yeah.
Yeah, so you have your containers, and under your containers are all your nested components. Mm-hmm. So everything that would actually need that data would actually be nested under the container. So instead of hitting Redux every time you go to a new component or you use a new component, you're actually just passing props down. And so the data's already there, your initial page load. Usually the way I structure my pages, it's each container is a new route. So if I have like user, login, sign up, whatever, etc., like that's all going to be my containers. And all the data I need for that container / page or whatever, this is like single page app, like thinking. Then I'll just load all my Redux data in the state on component mount, which is like a lifecycle method. And then my data's there, and then I'm passing all the data to props, and I'm just working, like moving along like I would normally.
Okay, so you're doing like, you're hitting one endpoint per container then? Or are you setting it just to the master container on mount and then passing that down to the rest of the
Resource or endpoint?
Well, I mean, I would say like endpoint from the API perspective, right? Like when you're mapping your containers to the...
Yeah, so there's multiple API endpoints happening when the container or the page loads.
Okay.
So I'm not just hitting one, I'll hit like multiple, depending on what the page needs.
Yeah.
But everything happens when on the container loading.
Okay.
And then components themselves usually are done this thing called like presentational or functional stateless components.
Yeah.
Like components that literally just return the data back, just styled for you. The React community, again, there's no conventions for React community, but the community is going this way. Like as many of those as possible will make your life much easier, for sure.
What do you like for testing React? And are you doing TDD with it?
So no on the TDD, but testing, I am a big fan of Enzyme. Enzyme is like basically much better. The thing that's built into React testing with React is they use Jest instead of Mocha.
Yeah.
I knew Mocha, so I just went with Mocha, and a lot of other people knew Mocha because everybody came from Angular or somewhere else that used Mocha. So Enzyme is out of, actually I don't even think Airbnb, yeah, it did it. Their version for React Native actually is not from Airbnb, but it's all part of that ecosystem. But anyway, I'm just confusing you. So Enzyme, basically. But super easy. Testing is almost trivial when it comes to React when you're passing just props. Mm-hmm. And you basically, as long as you don't have tons of logic, and that's again with Angular and even Rails, like we tend to get a lot of conditionals and a lot of logic in our templates, which is like a big no in Rails. Like I think the community like frowns upon that, but we still do it. React is like the opposite, where you want to get as less logic out of your component and shove that in the container. So like everything you need to get done and working happens on the page load, and then you're good to go. It's just pass data down, and that's about it. One-way data binding is like the buzzword. Last question, and you guys can just like come up to me and ask me questions.
It's not really a question, it's
Oh,
more
yeah.
just a comment to TDD approach. So these days so basically there are different levels of testing, right? Like integration testing or unit testing or whatever. So these days, like especially with things like API, you can stop and you can test on API level all your needs.
Yeah.
And that's actually an answer to guys like who's looking for speed. So basically, that's the next level of complexity, just building applications with, say, like API, some backend and front end. It requires more process, more discipline, and this mockups and this like integration point with tests by itself, that could help to solve this problem. Basically, where you can implement things like in your client ahead of your backend and test that.
Yeah. I'd actually, as far as TDD goes, my last project I TDD'd all the Rails stuff. So yes, on the TDD end. But when it comes to like the UI, again, like it's trivial. Like you're just like testing to see if like different classes and like data, like if the words show up on the page, and then like you're getting to like this weird thing, like should I be integration tests versus unit tests on UI things. So basically it's up in the air. I tend to unit test more of my components because as far as like seeing stuff happen, we use a different thing called Storybook, which is like the sandbox for React components. It's separate from React. Yeah, it's pretty new. It's within the last 6 months, React Storybook. We just got into it a couple weeks ago. And so today yesterday my designer gave me a component that we're going to be using on our new pricing page. He was able to mock it up in Storybook, get all the CSS, all my designer codes. It's pretty awesome. And get all the CSS and stuff like aligned and perfectly. And I just take that component and import it just like the import events. And I drop it in there, pass in the data, and I'm good to go. So it's super easy. Like they're able to test, they're able to see like how data is working in the Storybook, stuff like that. There's other options. A lot of people. This guy, I saw a talk and they built their own version of it. But yeah, you can totally do it. It's like this simple JavaScript and like putting stuff on a page. But I recommend Storybook because it's a framework already built for you to use, and it looks a lot like if you ever use Bootstrap's documentation, and you can like click through like buttons and see stuff happen on forms. Like it's exact same thing, but with React. Cool. If you guys have questions, definitely come up to me. That's my Twitter. I'll be blogging more about this stuff, this whole approach, because I'm still new to it too as well. And yeah, if you have questions, just find me. Thank you.